Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, January 15th, 2026, and we have an important update about what's going on in Iran. Just to recap, President Trump has been warning all along that if the Iranian regime is killing protesters, shooting protesters, or hanging protesters, the United States would step in, with military action. And they have been killing protesters. We're going to get into all of that. But bottom line is, things are really coming to a head. So let's get right into it. So yesterday, President Trump came out with the following statement.
We've been told that the killing in Iran is stopping, and it's stopped, and it's stopping. And there's no plan for executions or executions. So I've been told that on good authority. We'll find out about it. I'm sure if it happens, we'll all be very upset. Including you will be very upset, but that's just gotten to me, some information that the killing has stopped, that the executions have stopped. They're not going to have an execution.
Okay, so there you have President Trump saying that he has it on good authority that the killing has stopped, that they're not carrying out the executions. Now, that may or may not be true. We don't know. There is actually very little direct information coming out from the protests now that the regime has done a much better job at blocking all of the internet. And there's a lot of suspicion that this report to President Trump that the killing has stopped and that they're not executing people is really coming from sources that don't want America to attack. Again, we don't know for sure, but that is the suspicion. And in terms of that pressure on President Trump not to attack, where is it coming from? So this is where things get super interesting. Have a look at this. So Qatar warned that any U.S. escalation would be catastrophic for the region. Qatar has been pressuring very hard for the administration not to take any action. A military escalation between the United States and Iran would have grave consequences for the region, Qatar said on Tuesday after Washington threatened strikes in response to a government crackdown. We know that any escalation would have catastrophic results in the region and beyond, and therefore we want to avoid that as much as possible. So here's the Qataris pressuring the United States not to do anything. It's also been reported that Qatar rejected any use of any U.S. use of its airbase on its soil for military action against Iran. Now, this gets very interesting. The United States has its largest base, the CENTCOM headquarters in the region, is in Qatar. It's a massive army base in Qatar, massive Air Force base in Qatar. And here are the Qataris vetoing American use of this. Now, at the same time as short term, we could look at that and say, whoa, they could actually stop the Americans from doing this. And President Trump has been very careful about his relationship with the Qataris. He views them as an ally. He recently signed an executive order saying that if they come under attack, the United States would defend them. But here's the Qataris essentially tying the Americans' hands, tying Trump's hands. So it could very well be that down the road, this could kind of backfire on the Qataris, because I don't think President Trump is going to forget the fact that his decision-making was influenced by the Qataris telling him what he can and can't do. Nevertheless, the Qataris are pressuring pretty strongly, but it's not only Qatar, it's also Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has made it known that they will not allow their airspace to be used in a strike on Iran. And that's super interesting because traditionally, the Saudis are mortal enemies of the Iranian regime. They've been at war with each other. The Saudi Arabia has been at war with Iranian proxies. The Houthis and Saudi Arabia have been at war with each other for years. And it's quite well known that the Saudis view the Iranians as a major threat. So that leads to the question, why are the Saudis trying to prevent the Americans from carrying out an attack against the Iranian regime? It doesn't make any sense, right? Don't they hate the Iranians? And there's a lot of speculation about what the reasoning is. Reasoning that made sense to me. My first thought was, well, the Saudis and the Qataris also, they don't have democracies. And the last thing that they need is some kind of democracy breaking out all across the region. I think I said this in my update from yesterday, and that was my thinking, that it was kind of, political in the broad sense, in the kind of philosophical sense, or in the societal sense, that they didn't really want whatever's happening in the Iranian street to spread to their own countries. But then I read a fascinating post by David Wurmser. Now, David Wurmser was an advisor on the Middle East in the first Trump administration and in the Bush administration, and he's been on the National Security Council, and he is a senior fellow and the head of the Middle East Department at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. He is, suffice it to say, that David Wurmser, if you haven't heard of him, you should follow him. David Wurmser is one of the top experts in the Middle East in the world, and he put up a tweet yesterday. And I should also point out that he's a good friend of mine, and I'm proud of that. And he put up a tweet yesterday about why Saudi Arabia is opposed to the United States striking Iran, and it's absolutely fascinating. So let's take a look at that tweet. So here's what he writes there. He writes, "If Iran falls, Saudi is irrelevant because it would change the complexion of Iraq too, which would create an alternative corridor and strategic bloc that links with India/Japan to the east, is anchored to post-Ayatollah Iran and UAE, Iraq, Jordan, and then Israel onto Cyprus and Greece." Now, let me explain what he's saying there. Iraq is basically not a country. After the Saddam Hussein regime fell, ever since then, it kind of became an American protectorate, but there's also some Hezbollah there. It's a bit of a mess, but it doesn't really have air defenses, and it can kind of go either way. So Iraq sits just north of Jordan and west of Iran, north and a little bit northeast of Syria. That's where Iraq is. And with Jordan being a pro-American, pro-Western kingdom, and Syria now kind of within the orbit of the Americans, and Israel controlling the airspace over that area, if the Iranian regime falls and becomes pro-West, Iraq also would come into that orbit, because there'd be no reason for them to be anti-West at that point. And of course, the Hezbollah there would dry up or be gotten rid of, because they wouldn't have Iran backing them. But the main point that he's making in this opening paragraph of this is that there would be a corridor, a trade corridor that goes across from the east, from India/Japan, from the Far East, all the way through to the Mediterranean, that would make Saudi Arabia relevant. More on that in a moment. Let's finish what he's saying here. Saudi Arabia is far overplaying its hand. Iran is strategically 50 times as important as Saudi, and has one of the globe's most talented, industrious, and educated populations. We've talked about that in our previous updates. If Iran switches sides and aligns with the US, the UAE, and Israel, Saudi is rendered of marginal importance. Some might argue, but the oil, does anyone really think the Saudi regime would cut off the only significant source of revenue it gets to fund its essentially socialist economy, maintain its entire national structure, and pay all the foreign contractors upon which every single aspect of life in Saudi Arabia depends? It has no real industry, nor has it even educated its population sufficiently to have any industry emerge beyond the oil sector in the future. Now, let me explain what he's talking about here. This is really, really critical. You see, the United States has an interest in creating a trade corridor that goes from the Far East all the way through to Europe. Okay, and they've been working on this plan. The plan is called the IMEC corridor. Let me show you this so we can illustrate the point. Okay, this is the plan. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor is a plan of the United States to connect India, and of course the Far East connects easily to India, to connect it through mostly a land route, so that you could have trains, you could have other ways of shipping things by land that would bypass a lot of the waterways and go through to Europe through America-friendly countries. And the plan currently is called the India, Middle East, Europe Corridor, IMEC, and it goes from India through the UAE, through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and then on to Cyprus and Greece. And this bypasses all of these problematic countries. It bypasses Iran, of course, which is this mass over here. It bypasses Iraq. It bypasses Turkey, right? And it's a trade corridor. And why is the United States so hot on creating this trade corridor? Because the Chinese Communist Party, the main existential threat to America, has a similar plan that they've been working on and they've been moving forward on called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is their trade corridor linking the Far East to Europe. And that trade corridor runs through their allies. It runs through Iran, which, of course, the Iranian regime is closely allied with China, and it runs through Turkey. So you have the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, if China were to achieve its Belt and Road plan to have this land route that links the Far East with Europe, that's a massive advantage in trade. So the United States is trying to create a competing corridor, the IMEC corridor. And as you saw from that map, Saudi Arabia is a critical component to the IMEC corridor. But Saudi Arabia is always kind of hedged, and they're sort of pro-Western. Let's remember that the guys who blew up the World Trade Center and Al Qaeda, they used to be based in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was a very radicalized Islamic country, and then they shifted, and they're going through quote unquote reforms. Even though their population has not been educated toward these reforms, they're becoming closer to the West. They're critical to the IMEC corridor so long as there's an anti-West Iran. Once Iran is not anti-Western anymore, right? Again, take a look at the map. Once Iran is not anti-West, you don't need Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia doesn't have that leverage anymore. And the corridor could just run up through, it could run up through Iran. In fact, it's even smoother. There's less water to get through. And Saudi Arabia is, of course, an Islamic dictatorship. And therefore, the Americans would very likely choose to work with a pro-Western Iran, a pro-Western post-Ayatollah Iran over dealing with the Saudis, or at the very least, they'd have their options. And therefore, and also in terms of providing oil to the West, Saudi Arabia would become less important because currently Western nations don't buy Iranian oil. So the Saudis have every interest. Let me boil this down. The Saudis actually don't want the Iranian regime to fall. They want the Iranian regime to be weak, but to remain. Because as long as the Iranian regime, this radical anti-Western, death to America, death to Israel regime remains in Tehran, that means that Western nations won't buy their oil. It means that they won't be part of the Americans' IMEC corridor. And that increases Saudi Arabia's importance and gives them all this leverage because the Americans need them and the West needs them. If the Iranian regime falls, David Wormser explains, if the Iranian regime falls, the Saudis become irrelevant. And that is what they are terrified about. So that's the reason why the Saudis are screaming from the rooftops that America should not attack Iran, saying you can't even use our airspace. Apparently, they warned the other day, I saw a report that they warned the Americans that there will be a massive spike in oil prices in the United States if Iran gets attacked. I do not know why that would be the case. And if it would be, it would probably only be very short term. Let's recall that there were also, these same voices were screaming that if Iran's nuclear facilities were hit in the 12-day war in June, there'd be this massive spike in oil prices, which of course never came. So it's fear-mongering by the Saudis. But as David Wormser explains, and I think this is a fantastic explanation, the Saudis are terrified of losing their own power base. Now, it might also be true that they're afraid of democracy spreading in the region. It's the last thing they need. But that's what is behind Saudi Arabia's attempt to prevent the Trump administration from attacking Iran. And we still don't know where this is going to go. Again, President Trump has been really cozying up to the Qataris and the Saudis ever since he came into office. And now that they're pressuring him not to attack Iran, along with the more isolationist wing around him, very much led by Vice President J.D. Vance in the White House, who are pushing against military action. But on the other hand, if President Trump does not take military action, then he becomes just like Obama, who he disparaged the other day, making empty threats and not fulfilling them. And that's why he has to claim he has to claim, or people around him have to claim, that the killing has stopped. Someone told President Trump the killing has stopped. And you saw in that video that he's a little skeptical. He's like, yeah, we'll see. We'll see if it's true. We'll look into it. Because someone's been telling him that the killing has stopped. They're not executing people. So there's no reason to attack, giving cover for President Trump to not attack and not fulfill his threats. So things are really tense right now. It's kind of a standoff, kind of a game of chicken. And we're going to see where this is headed. We will continue to bring you more updates in the coming days.